I saved a man's life with 3 whispered words, and in doing so, I sealed my fate to his forever. They say a servant should be invisible, but on that autumn evening in the grand dining hall of Ashworth Manor, I became the most visible woman in all of England. My name is Ivy Mercer, and I was 19 years old when I first crossed the threshold of that magnificent house, carrying nothing but a small leather trunk and the weight of my father's failures. He had been a boticary in the village of Thornbury, a man who knew the secrets of every herb and root that grew in English soil, but he had also been a man who trusted too easily and loved too deeply. When his business partner absconded with our savings and my mother's heart gave out from the shock of our ruin, I found myself alone in the world, with nothing but the knowledge my father had pressed into my mind, like flowers between the pages of a book. I remember the day I arrived at Ashworth Manor as though it were painted in oils upon the canvas of my memory. The October sky hung low and gray above the estate, and the great house rose before me like a sleeping giant of stone and ivy. 300 years of history lived within those walls, 300 years of Blackwell dukes who had shaped the destiny of this corner of England. The current duke, I had been told by the housekeeper who hired me, was a man of 34 years, recently emerged from the mourning period for his young wife, who had perished 2 winters past. He was said to be cold, distant, and utterly uninterested in the workings of his household, so long as everything ran with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. The carriage that had brought me from the village deposited me at the servants' entrance, a modest door tucked away at the eastern side of the great house where deliveries were made, and the lower orders came and went without disturbing the pristine grandeur of the main facade. I remember standing there for a long moment, my small trunk at my feet, staring up at the rows of windows that seemed to watch me like disapproving eyes. Somewhere inside those walls, my new life awaited me. A life of service, of invisibility, of endless toil in exchange for a bed and 3 meals a day. It was not the future I had imagined for myself as a girl, dreaming over my father's books of botanical illustrations. But it was the future I had been given, and I was determined to make the best of it. The door opened before I could knock, revealing a thin-faced woman with sharp cheekbones and sharper eyes. This was Mrs. Pemberton, I would learn, the housekeeper who ruled the servants' quarters with an iron fist encased in a velvet glove. She looked me up and down with the practiced assessment of someone who had spent decades evaluating the worth of prospective employees, and whatever she saw must have met her standards, for she nodded once and stepped aside to let me enter. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with steel-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the very skin of her face. She walked me through the servants' entrance on that first day, her black skirts rustling against the flagstone floors as she recited the rules that would govern my existence. I was to be a parlor maid, she explained, which meant I would dust and polish and arrange flowers and never, under any circumstances, speak to a member of the family unless directly addressed. I was to rise before dawn and retire only after the family had gone to bed. I was to eat in the servants' hall, worship in the servants' pew at the village church, and remember at all times that I existed to serve, not to be seen. I accepted these conditions with the quiet resignation of a woman who had no other choice. My father's debts had consumed everything we owned, and the small salary I would earn at Ashworth Manor was the only thing standing between me and the workhouse. So I learned to walk silently, to lower my eyes, to become as invisible as the furniture I polished each morning. The manor itself was a labyrinth of grandeur and shadow. The main house contained 47 rooms, not counting the servants' quarters in the east wing or the kitchens that sprawled beneath the ground floor, like the roots of an ancient tree. There were drawing rooms draped in silk damask, libraries lined with leather-bound volumes that stretched from floor to ceiling, and a ballroom with crystal chandeliers that caught the light and scattered it like diamonds across the parquet floors. In the west wing stood the private apartments of the Duke, rooms I was forbidden to enter except when summoned by the head housemaid to assist with the deep cleaning that occurred twice each year. For the first 3 months of my service, I caught only glimpses of the Duke of Ashworth. He was a tall man, broad of shoulder, with hair the color of a raven's wing and eyes that held all the warmth of a winter storm. I would see him striding through the corridors on his way to the stables or standing at the windows of his study, gazing out at the parkland that stretched for miles in every direction. He never looked at me. I doubt he even knew I existed. To him, I was merely another function of the household, as unremarkable as the ticking of the grandfather clock in the entrance hall. But I looked at him. God forgive me, I looked at him far more than I should have. My duties brought me to every corner of the manor, and I learned its secrets as one learns the contours of a familiar face. I knew which floorboards creaked and which doors stuck in wet weather. I knew where the morning light fell most beautifully and where the shadows gathered thickest when night descended. I knew the routines of every member of the household, from the cook who rose before dawn to begin the day's baking, to the footman who polished the silver until it gleamed like mirrors, to the ladies' maids who pressed and prepared the gowns that would never be worn by the Duchess who had died. The other servants were kind to me, in their way. There was Agnes, the scullery maid who had been at Ashworth since she was a girl of 12 and knew every shortcut through the labyrinthine kitchens. There was Thomas, the first footman who harbored dreams of one day becoming a butler in a grand London house. There was Martha, the head housemaid who had served under 3 generations of Blackwell mistresses and whose knowledge of the family's history was encyclopedic. And there was Mr. Brennan, the butler, a dignified man of 60 years who presided over the male servants with the gravity of a bishop presiding over his congregation. From these companions in service, I learned the unwritten rules that governed life below stairs. I learned that gossip was currency, to be traded carefully and never squandered. I learned that loyalty to the family was paramount, but loyalty to one's fellow servants ran a close second. I learned that the smallest infractions could result in dismissal without reference, while larger offenses might be overlooked if one had proven oneself useful. And I learned, above all else, that the line between upstairs and downstairs was not to be crossed, not in word, not in deed, not even in thought. There was something in his face that called to me, something behind the coldness that spoke of a grief so profound it had frozen him from the inside out. I learned from the other servants that his wife, the late Duchess, had been a gentle creature of barely 20 years when she died. They had been married for only 18 months, an arranged union between 2 great families. But those who had witnessed them together said that the Duke had loved her with a devotion that bordered on worship. When she succumbed to a fever that swept through the county, taking rich and poor alike, he had locked himself in his chambers for a fortnight and emerged a changed man. The warmth that had once softened his aristocratic features had vanished, replaced by an impenetrable wall of ice that no one had been able to breach. I told myself that my fascination with him was nothing more than the idle curiosity of a young woman starved for novelty. My days were long and monotonous, filled with the same tasks repeated in the same order, and the mysterious figure of the grieving Duke provided a welcome distraction from the tedium. I did not allow myself to imagine anything more. The distance between a parlor maid and a duke was not merely a matter of stations. It was a chasm so vast that even dreaming of crossing it seemed like madness. And then there was Lavinia. Lady Lavinia Ashworth was the widow of the Duke's elder brother, Frederick, who had died in a riding accident some 5 years before I entered service at the manor. Frederick had been the heir, the one groomed from birth to inherit the title and the estate, and his death had thrust his younger brother into a position he had never wanted and never prepared for. Lavinia, who had expected to be a duchess, found herself instead a dowager with a modest income and a suite of rooms in the east wing of the house that had once been meant to be hers entirely. She was beautiful in the way that a winter rose is beautiful, all pale skin and sharp angles, and eyes the color of a frozen lake. At 30 years of age, she moved through the manor like a queen in exile, presiding over the household with an authority that Mrs. Pemberton resented but could not challenge. For though Lavinia held no official position, she had managed the estate during the years of Cormac's grief, and the servants had grown accustomed to following her commands. I remember the first time I saw her clearly. It was a gray afternoon in November, and I had been sent to dust the portrait gallery on the second floor. The gallery was a long, narrow room lined with generations of Blackwell ancestors, their painted eyes following me as I moved from frame to frame with my cloth and polish. Lavinia entered without announcement, her silk skirts whispering against the polished floors, and I immediately dropped into a curtsy and lowered my eyes as protocol demanded. She did not speak to me. She simply walked the length of the gallery, pausing before each portrait as though communing with the ghosts of the family she had married into. When she reached the end of the room, she turned and walked back, her footsteps slow and measured. As she passed me, she paused. "You are the new girl," she said, "the boticary's daughter." I did not ask how she knew. The servants gossiped, and nothing remained secret for long in a house this size. "Yes, my lady," I replied, keeping my voice carefully neutral. She studied me for a long moment, her pale eyes traveling over my face with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "You have an intelligent look about you," she said at last. "See that you do not let it lead you into trouble." Then she swept past me and out of the gallery, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of her perfume, something floral and cold, like flowers blooming in a graveyard. I sensed from the beginning that there was something dangerous beneath her elegant exterior. The way she watched the Duke when she thought no one was looking. The way her fingers tightened on her wineglass whenever he spoke of eventually remarrying to produce an heir. The way she smiled at me with lips that never warmed her eyes. She was a woman with ambitions that had been thwarted by fate, and I could not shake the feeling that she was merely biding her time, waiting for an opportunity to reclaim what she believed should have been hers. The evening that changed everything began like any other autumn supper at Ashworth Manor. The Duke was entertaining a small party of guests, Lord and Lady Hartwell from the neighboring estate, Mr. Edmund Blackwell, who was a distant cousin, and the Duke's heir presumptive, and of course Lady Lavinia, who served as hostess in the absence of a duchess. I was assigned to assist in the dining room that night, a task that usually fell to the footmen, but was extended to the parlor maids when extra hands were needed. The autumn rain had been falling steadily since midday, drumming against the tall windows and turning the world beyond the glass into a blur of gray and green. Inside, however, all was warmth and light. The chandeliers blazed with dozens of candles, their flames reflected in the polished surface of the mahogany table. A fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace at the far end of the room, casting dancing shadows on the painted ceiling where cherubs frolicked among gilded clouds. The scent of beeswax and wood smoke mingled with the savory aromas drifting up from the kitchens below. I stood against the wall in my starched black uniform, watching as the guests took their seats around the long mahogany table. The ritual of a formal dinner was something I had witnessed many times now, but it never ceased to fascinate me. The intricate dance of precedence as guests were seated according to rank, the subtle signals between footmen that coordinated the service of each course, the careful choreography of conversation, designed to entertain without offending, to impress without appearing to try. Candles flickered in silver candelabra, casting dancing shadows across the painted ceiling where cherubs frolicked among gilded clouds. The table was set with the Ashworth china, delicate porcelain rimmed with gold, and the family silver gleamed in the warm light. At the head of the table sat the Duke, resplendent in his evening clothes, his dark hair brushed back from a face that might have been carved from marble. I allowed myself to look at him, just for a moment. He was listening to something Lord Hartwell was saying, his expression politely attentive, but his eyes distant, as though his thoughts were elsewhere entirely. There was a weariness about him tonight, a heaviness in the set of his shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights and burdens too heavy to bear. I wondered what he thought about in those quiet hours before dawn, when the house slept and even dukes were allowed to be merely human. The first course was a clear consomme, brought up from the kitchens in a great silver tureen. I watched as Thomas, the first footman, ladled the golden broth into each bowl, starting with Lady Hartwell as the highest-ranking female guest and working his way around the table. The ritual was familiar, almost hypnotic in its precision. Each bowl filled to exactly the same level, each bowl placed before its recipient with exactly the same flourish. The mechanics of service, executed with the smooth efficiency of a well-oiled machine. When Thomas reached the Duke's place, he filled the bowl with the same practiced precision and stepped back to await further instructions. The conversation continued around the table, a pleasant murmur of voices discussing the weather, the hunting season, the latest gossip from London. No one paid any attention to me. I was as invisible as the wallpaper, as unremarkable as the furniture. It was then that I noticed something strange. The steam rising from the Duke's bowl had a faint shimmer to it, a barely perceptible iridescence that was absent from the other servings. My father had taught me to observe such things, to notice the subtle signs that distinguished a healing draught from a poison. He had shown me how certain substances, when dissolved in liquid, could alter the way light moved through the steam. He had made me memorize the properties of arsenic, of belladonna, of foxglove and hemlock, and all the deadly plants that grew in English gardens. It was knowledge I had hoped never to use, knowledge I had tried to forget in the years since his death. But in that moment, standing invisible against the wall of the Ashworth dining room, everything he had taught me came flooding back with terrible clarity. I watched as the Duke lifted his silver spoon, as he dipped it into the broth with the casual indifference of a man who had never had reason to fear his own supper. The spoon descended toward the surface of the consomme, and I knew with a certainty that turned my blood to ice what I was about to witness. I did not think. I did not consider the consequences. I simply moved. "Do not eat, my lord," I whispered, stepping forward from my place against the wall. The words left my lips before I could stop them, cutting through the murmur of polite conversation like a blade through silk. Every head at the table turned toward me, every eye fixed upon the parlor maid who had committed the unthinkable sin of speaking unbidden in the presence of her betters. The Duke's hand froze with the spoon halfway to his lips. His gray eyes, cold as a winter sky, locked onto mine with an intensity that made my heart stutter in my chest. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down upon me, could sense the outrage building in Lady Lavinia's rigid posture, could hear Mrs. Pemberton's sharp intake of breath from her position near the sideboard. "Your spoon," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "Please, my lord, look at your spoon." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the Duke simply stared at me. Then, with a deliberation that spoke of a mind trained to assess threats quickly and calmly, he lowered his gaze to the silver implement in his hand. The spoon had turned black. Where the polished silver had touched the surface of the consomme, a dark tarnish had spread across the metal like ink bleeding through water. The Duke's face drained of color as he recognized what he was seeing, as the implications of that blackened spoon became horrifyingly clear to everyone seated at the table. "Arsenic," he said, and the single word fell into the silence like a stone into a still pond. "Someone has put arsenic in my soup." The chaos that followed is difficult to describe. Lady Hartwell screamed and pushed back from the table so violently that her chair toppled backward. Lord Hartwell leaped to his feet, his face purple with shock and indignation. Mr. Edmund Blackwell, the cousin who stood to inherit everything if the Duke died without issue, went pale as a ghost and began stammering protestations of innocence that no one had yet accused him of needing to make. And Lady Lavinia, beautiful, cold Lady Lavinia, sat frozen in her seat with an expression I could not read, her eyes fixed upon the blackened spoon, as though it were a serpent that might strike at any moment. The rain continued to beat against the windows, indifferent to the drama unfolding within. Thomas stood frozen by the sideboard, the ladle still clutched in his white-gloved hand, his face a mask of horror. Mrs. Pemberton had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion, and her sharp intake of breath was audible even above the chaos. The Duke rose slowly from his chair, the poisoned bowl pushed away from him with careful precision. There was something almost admirable about his composure in that moment. Any other man might have panicked, might have demanded answers in a voice raw with fear. But Cormac Blackwell simply stood, his posture rigid with controlled fury, and surveyed the scene before him with the cold assessment of a general observing a battlefield. His gaze swept around the table, taking in the faces of his guests, before coming to rest once more upon me. "You," he said, "the maid. How did you know?" I could feel every eye in the room upon me, could feel my future hanging in the balance. The weight of their stares was almost physical, pressing down upon me like a stone upon my chest. My heart hammered against my ribs, and my palms grew slick with nervous sweat. Everything I had worked for, the security I had built, the life I had scraped together from the ruins of my father's failures, all of it could be swept away in an instant if I said the wrong thing. If I told the truth, I would reveal knowledge that a simple parlor maid should not possess. If I lied, I would never be believed. So I chose the only path left to me. I told a partial truth and prayed it would be enough. "My father was a boticary, my lord," I said, keeping my voice steady through sheer force of will. "He taught me to recognize the signs of certain poisons. The steam from your bowl, it had a shimmer that the others lacked, and silver tarnishes when it touches arsenic. It is an old test, one that has saved many lives." The Duke studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the continued patter of rain against glass and the quiet sobbing of Lady Hartwell, who had collapsed into her husband's arms. I forced myself to hold his gaze, to not look away despite every instinct screaming at me to lower my eyes and retreat into the invisibility that had protected me for so long. Then he turned to the first footman, who stood trembling by the sideboard. "Thomas," he said, "where did this consomme come from?" "From the kitchens, your grace," Thomas stammered. "It was prepared by cook, same as always. I ladled it from the tureen myself, but you did not ladle from the same part of the tureen for each bowl," the Duke observed. "My serving came from a different section." Thomas's face crumpled with confusion and fear. "I do not understand, your grace. I simply served as I always do, starting from one side and working my way around." The Duke's eyes narrowed. Then the poison was not in the tureen itself. It was placed directly into my bowl, either before or after it was filled. A fresh wave of murmurs swept through the room. The implications were clear. Whoever had poisoned the Duke's soup had done so deliberately, targeting him specifically rather than attempting to poison the entire table. This was not an accident. This was attempted murder. "Mrs. Pemberton," the Duke said, his voice cutting through the whispers like a knife, "clear the room. No one is to leave the manor tonight. I want every servant questioned and every inch of the kitchen searched. And someone send for the magistrate." The housekeeper sprang into action, her earlier shock replaced by the brisk efficiency that had served her well for 30 years in service. Footmen ushered the guests toward the drawing room, where brandy was being poured with shaking hands. Maids scattered to carry out their orders. And through it all, I remained standing where I was, unsure whether to flee or to wait, unsure of my place in this unfolding drama. The Duke approached me. Up close, he was even more imposing than he appeared from across a room, his height and breadth blocking out the candlelight, his presence filling the space between us until I felt I could scarcely breathe. But there was something else in his face now, something that softened the hard lines around his mouth and warmed the ice in his eyes. It was gratitude, I realized, and something more, something that looked almost like curiosity. "You saved my life," he said. A parlor maid with the knowledge of a boticary and the courage to speak when any other servant would have remained silent. "I did only what was right, my lord," I replied, lowering my eyes as propriety demanded. "Any person of conscience would have done the same, but any other person would not have known what to look for," he said. "Any other person would have watched me take that first spoonful and die wondering what had caused my sudden illness. You knew. You saw what others could not see, and you acted." He paused, and I felt the weight of his gaze like a physical touch. "What is your name?" he asked. "Ivy, my lord." "Ivy Mercer." "Ivy," he repeated, and the sound of my name on his lips sent a shiver through me that I could not explain. "You will not return to your duties tonight. I would like you to remain available for questioning, and I have questions of my own that I wish to ask you. Mrs. Pemberton will see you to a guest chamber where you can rest until I send for you." A guest chamber. The words seemed impossible, absurd. Parlor maids did not sleep in guest chambers. Parlor maids slept in narrow beds in cramped rooms under the eaves, 4 to a chamber, with barely enough space to turn around. But the Duke had spoken, and his word was law within these walls. "Yes, my lord," I said, because there was nothing else to say. He nodded once, then turned and strode from the dining room without looking back. I stood alone among the scattered chairs and abandoned plates, staring at the blackened spoon that still lay beside the Duke's untouched bowl, and wondered what fate had just set in motion. The guest chamber to which Mrs. Pemberton escorted me was finer than any room I had ever occupied in my life. The bed was canopied in deep blue velvet, the furniture was polished mahogany, and a fire crackled merrily in the marble fireplace. Thick carpets muffled my footsteps, and the walls were hung with tapestries depicting pastoral scenes of shepherdesses and their flocks. A writing desk stood by the window, furnished with ivory paper and a silver inkwell, and beside the bed a small table held a crystal decanter of water and a delicate porcelain cup. I sat on the edge of the bed, still in my black uniform, still wearing the starched white apron that marked me as a servant, and tried to make sense of the evening's events. The silk coverlet was cool and smooth beneath my fingers, impossibly luxurious after the rough wool blankets of the servants' quarters. I felt like an imposter, a fraud who had somehow stumbled into a world where she did not belong. At any moment, I expected someone to burst through the door and drag me back to my proper place, to the narrow bed and cramped room that was all someone of my station deserved. But no one came. Outside the windows, the rain had intensified into a proper storm. Lightning flickered across the sky, illuminating the gardens below in brief, ghostly flashes. Thunder rumbled in the distance like the grumbling of some ancient beast. I watched the storm for a long while, letting the sound of the rain calm my racing thoughts. Someone had tried to kill the Duke of Ashworth. Someone within this house. Someone with access to the dining room and the opportunity to poison his food. The list of suspects was not long. The cook had prepared the meal, but arsenic in that quantity would have been noticed by anyone who tasted the consomme before serving. The footman had handled the dishes, but Thomas had served from a common tureen, and the poison had been in the Duke's bowl alone. That left the guests themselves, or someone who had managed to access the bowl between the kitchen and the table. My mind kept returning to Lady Lavinia. I had no evidence, only instinct, but the expression on her face when the blackened spoon was revealed had not been shock or horror. It had been something closer to frustration, as though a carefully laid plan had just been thwarted by an unexpected variable, as though she had watched a chess game turn against her at the very moment of victory. A knock at the door startled me from my thoughts. Before I could respond, it opened to reveal not a servant, but the Duke himself. He had removed his evening coat and cravat, his white shirt open at the collar in a way that would have been scandalous in any proper setting. His dark hair was disheveled, as though he had been running his hands through it, and there was a weariness in his face that made him look older than his 34 years, but his eyes were alert, sharp, and they fixed upon me with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. "May I come in?" he asked, and the fact that he asked at all, that he did not simply enter as was his right, told me something important about the kind of man he was. "Of course, my lord. This is your house." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, a breach of propriety so enormous that I felt my cheeks flush with heat. A man alone with a woman in her bedchamber, even if that woman was merely a servant, even if the chamber was merely borrowed, the gossip alone could destroy my reputation. As if reading my thoughts, he said, "I apologize for the impropriety, but I find myself in need of counsel, and you are the only person in this house I am certain did not try to kill me tonight." The bluntness of his statement took me off guard. I blinked at him, momentarily at a loss for words. "My lord," I began. "Cormac," he said. "My name is Cormac, and I would like you to use it, at least when we are alone. I find that titles create distance, and distance is something I have had quite enough of in recent years." I could not bring myself to speak his Christian name. It seemed too intimate, too dangerous. So I said nothing, and after a moment he continued. "The magistrate has been sent for, but he will not arrive until morning. In the meantime, I have questioned the staff, searched the kitchens, and examined every inch of the dining room. I have found nothing. No hidden vials, no discarded packets, no evidence of any kind that might point to the would-be poisoner." "And the guests?" I asked. "The guests have retired to their chambers under strict instructions not to leave until the magistrate has spoken with them. Lord and Lady Hartwell are outraged at being treated like suspects, but they have no choice but to comply. Edmund is terrified, though whether from genuine innocence or guilty conscience, I cannot tell. And Lavinia—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "And Lady Lavinia," I prompted. "Lavinia has been perfectly calm," he said, "perfectly composed. She has offered her condolences, expressed her horror at the attack, and retired to her rooms with a glass of warm milk and a book of poetry. She is either innocent or she is the finest actress I have ever encountered." "You suspect her?" I said. It was not a question. The Duke, Cormac, turned to face me fully. His eyes searched mine with an intensity that made me feel as though he were looking directly into my soul. "I suspect everyone," he said. "But yes, if I am honest, I suspect her most of all. Frederick's death left her in an untenable position. She expected to be a duchess, to rule over this estate for the rest of her life. Instead, she found herself a widow with a modest allowance and a suite of rooms that might be taken from her at any moment. If I were to marry again, to produce an heir, her position would become even more precarious. And if I were to die without issue, then your cousin Edmund would inherit," I said, following his line of reasoning. "But he would be a far more malleable master than you. He might allow Lady Lavinia to remain, might even welcome her guidance in managing an estate he knows nothing about." "Exactly," the Duke said. "Edmund has no experience with estate management. He has spent his life as a scholar, buried in books and academic pursuits. If he inherited Ashworth, he would be utterly dependent on someone who understood the workings of the household, someone like Lavinia." "But this is all speculation," I said. "You have no proof." "No," he admitted, "I have no proof. Which is why I am here, speaking to a parlor maid as though she were my trusted advisor, because you saw what no one else saw tonight. You noticed the shimmer in the steam, the sign of poison that everyone else missed. And I find myself wondering what else you might notice, if you were looking." I understood then what he was asking of me. He wanted me to be his eyes and ears within the household, to watch and observe and report back to him anything suspicious. It was a dangerous proposition, one that could put me in direct conflict with whoever had attempted his murder. But it was also an opportunity, a chance to be something more than invisible. "You want me to spy for you," I said. "I want you to help me find the truth," he replied. "I cannot trust the magistrate to uncover what happened tonight. He is a local man, easily influenced by money and title. By the time he completes his investigation, any evidence will have been destroyed and any witnesses will have been silenced. But you, Ivy, you move through this house like a ghost. You see everything and are seen by no one. You could go places I cannot go, ask questions I cannot ask. And if I am caught, then I will protect you, he said. Whatever happens, whatever the outcome of this investigation, I give you my word that you will not suffer for your loyalty to me. It was a promise no duke should make to a servant. It was a promise that crossed every line of propriety and station that governed our world. And yet, looking into his eyes, I believed him. Very well, I said. I will help you, but I have conditions. His eyebrows rose in surprise. Conditions? I will not lie for you, I said. I will not bear false witness against anyone, even if you believe them to be guilty. I will observe and report what I see, but I will not manufacture evidence or twist the truth to suit your suspicions. A faint smile touched his lips, the first genuine expression of warmth I had seen on his face since my arrival at Ashworth Manor. You are an unusual woman, Ivy Mercer, he said. I am a boticary's daughter, I replied. We deal in truth, even when it is unpleasant. He nodded slowly, accepting my terms. Then we have an agreement, he said. Tomorrow, the investigation begins in earnest. Tonight, try to rest. You have had quite an ordeal. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. Ivy, he said, without turning around, thank you. For saving my life. For being brave when courage was costly. I will not forget it. Then he was gone, leaving me alone with the crackling fire and the weight of what I had just agreed to do. I did not sleep that night. How could I? When every shadow seemed to hold a threat, when every creak of the old house sounded like footsteps approaching my door. I lay in that magnificent bed, staring at the canopy above me, and thought about the path that had brought me to this moment. A year ago, I had been a boticary's daughter with a modest dowry and reasonable prospects. 6 months ago, I had been a pauper, selling my mother's jewelry to pay my father's debts. 3 months ago, I had been a parlor maid, invisible and unremarkable, and now, somehow, I had become the confidant of a duke, a spy in a house full of secrets, a woman caught up in a web of murder and intrigue that I could not begin to untangle. The morning brought gray skies and the arrival of Magistrate Thornton, a portly man with a red face and a manner that suggested he was far more comfortable dealing with poached pheasants than attempted murder. He questioned the staff with a bored efficiency, clearly eager to conclude his investigation and return to his comfortable home. His questions were perfunctory, his interest minimal. By noon, he had declared the incident a probable accident, theorizing that the arsenic had somehow contaminated the food during preparation, and recommended that the kitchens be thoroughly cleaned before any further meals were served. The Duke accepted his verdict with a calm that masked, I knew, a seething frustration. He thanked the magistrate for his service, saw him to his carriage, and then retreated to his study without a word to anyone. An hour later, a note was delivered to my chamber by one of the footmen. It contained only 4 words, written in a bold, masculine hand. The library. After dark. I spent the rest of the day performing my usual duties under Mrs. Pemberton's watchful eye. If the housekeeper suspected that something had changed between the Duke and myself, she gave no sign of it. She assigned me to polish the silver in the butler's pantry, a tedious task that kept me isolated from the rest of the staff and gave me ample time to think. The silver collection at Ashworth Manor was extensive. Hundreds of pieces accumulated over generations of Blackwell prosperity. Spoons and forks, serving platters and candelabra, tea services and wine coolers. Each piece bore the family crest, a raven with wings spread wide, and each piece required careful attention to restore its luster. As I worked my way through the collection, my mind wandered to the blackened spoon that had revealed the poison in the Duke's consomme. silver tarnished when exposed to sulfur compounds, and arsenic often contained trace amounts of sulfur impurities that could cause exactly such a reaction. It was not a foolproof test, my father had always cautioned. Other substances could cause similar tarnishing. But in the context of a poisoning attempt, it was damning evidence indeed. The library to which the note summoned me was a room I knew well from my dusting duties, a vast space lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with volumes on every subject imaginable. By day, it was a monument to learning, sunlight streaming through tall windows to illuminate the gilded spines of thousands of books. By night, it was something else entirely, a cathedral of shadows where the firelight caught the gold lettering and made the titles dance like whispered secrets. A fire burned low in the hearth, and the Duke stood before it, staring into the flames with the brooding intensity of a man wrestling with demons. The light painted his features in shades of amber and shadow, emphasizing the strong line of his jaw, the dark sweep of his brows, the troubled depth of his gray eyes. He did not turn when I entered, though I was certain he had heard me. For a long moment, we remained like that. He gazing into the flames, I hovering near the doorway, uncertain whether to advance or retreat. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost weary. "You came," he said. "You asked me to," I replied. He turned then, and something in his expression shifted. The coldness that usually armored his features softened, replaced by something warmer, something almost vulnerable. In the dancing firelight, he looked younger somehow, less like a duke and more like the man he might have been if fate had dealt him a different hand. He gestured to a chair by the fire, and I sat, acutely aware of the impropriety of our situation. A duke and a maid, alone together after dark, speaking as equals rather than master and servant. If anyone were to discover us, the scandal would be immense. Servants had been dismissed for far less. And yet, sitting there in the warmth of the library, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, I could not bring myself to care. "The magistrate is a fool," the Duke said, settling into the chair across from mine. His voice was bitter, edged with a frustration that I sensed had been building all day. He saw only what he wanted to see, what was easiest to believe. An accident, a contamination, anything but the truth. "And what is the truth?" I asked. "That someone in this house wants me dead," he said. "And they will try again. The only question is when and whether I can stop them before they succeed." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gray eyes intent upon my face. "Tell me what you observed today," he said. "Anything unusual, anything out of place." I considered for a moment before responding. "The staff is frightened," I said. "They whisper among themselves when they think no one is listening. Most of them believe it was an accident, as the magistrate said. But there are a few who are not so sure." "Which ones?" "Martha, the head housemaid," I said. "She has served at Ashworth for 20 years, and she knows this house better than anyone. She told me that she saw Lady Lavinia in the corridor outside the dining room an hour before dinner was served. There was no reason for her to be there at that time. The family does not usually enter that part of the house until the meal is announced." The Duke's eyes narrowed. "What else?" "Thomas, the footman who served the consomme. He has been sick all day, confined to his bed with stomach pains. The cook believes he ate something that disagreed with him, but I wonder if perhaps he was given something to cloud his memory, to make him unable to recall exactly what happened in the dining room." "You think he was drugged?" "I think it is possible," I said carefully. "There are substances that can cause confusion and memory loss, substances that would be easy to slip into a cup of tea or a glass of wine. If someone wanted to ensure that Thomas could not provide a clear account of the evening's events, such a drug would be the perfect tool." The Duke was silent for a long moment, digesting this information. "You have a mind for intrigue?" he said at last. "I wonder if your father taught you that as well, or if it comes naturally." "I learned early that the world is not always what it seems," I replied. My father showed me the beauty that could be found in nature, in the healing properties of plants and herbs. But he also showed me the darkness, the poisons that lurked in the most innocent-looking flowers. He taught me to look beneath the surface, to question what others accepted without thought. Perhaps that is why I noticed the shimmer in the steam when no one else did. The Duke regarded me with an expression I could not quite read. "My wife died 2 years ago," he said, and the abruptness of the statement caught me off guard. Her name was Eleanor. She was kind and gentle and utterly unprepared for the role fate had thrust upon her. Frederick was supposed to inherit. He was supposed to be the Duke. I was the spare, the second son, free to live my life without the burden of responsibility. And then Frederick fell from his horse, and everything changed. He paused, his gaze distant, lost in memories. "Eleanor did her best," he continued. "She tried to be the Duchess this house needed, the wife I needed, but she was fragile, in body and in spirit. When the fever came, she had no strength to fight it. I watched her waste away over the course of a fortnight, helpless to save her, helpless to do anything but hold her hand as she slipped beyond my reach. I am sorry," I said, and I meant it. To lose someone you love is a pain that never fully heals. He looked at me sharply, as though surprised by my understanding. "You speak as though you know," he said. "I lost both my parents within a year of each other," I replied. "My father to debt and despair, my mother to a broken heart. I understand what it is to be alone in the world, with no one to turn to and nothing to hold on to but your own strength." Something passed between us in that moment, a recognition of shared grief that transcended the boundaries of class and station. He was a duke, I was a servant, but in that fire-lit library, we were simply two people who had known loss and somehow survived it. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, sending up sparks that danced like fireflies before vanishing into the darkness of the chimney. Outside, the wind had risen, rattling the windows in their frames, but inside, all was warmth and stillness. "I have not spoken of Eleanor to anyone since her death," he said quietly. "The household knows better than to mention her name. Even Lavinia, who was her closest companion in those final months, does not speak of her in my presence. But something about you, Ivy, makes me want to tell you things I have told no one else." I did not know how to respond to such a confession. The intimacy of the moment frightened me, even as it drew me in. I was acutely aware of how easy it would be to fall, to lose myself in the warmth of his attention, to forget that I was merely a means to an end, a tool to help him find a killer. And yet, even as my rational mind screamed warnings, my heart was already tumbling headlong into an abyss from which there would be no escape. He was looking at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. The firelight played across his features, softening the hard planes of his face, illuminating the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. He was beautiful, I realized. Not in the way that the word is usually used, not in the soft, pretty way of romantic heroes in novels. His was a harsh beauty, all sharp edges and deep shadows, the beauty of a storm-swept moor or a winter sky heavy with snow. It was the kind of beauty that could break your heart if you let it. "We should focus on the matter at hand," I said, more brusquely than I intended. The words came out sharper than I meant them to, a desperate attempt to rebuild the walls that were crumbling around me. "If Lady Lavinia is indeed behind the poisoning attempt, we need to find proof." The Duke blinked, as though waking from a dream, and the vulnerable man I had glimpsed retreated behind his customary mask of cool detachment. I told myself I was relieved. I told myself it was better this way. But even as I thought it, I knew it for a lie. "You are right, of course," he said. "Sentiment will not catch a murderer." He rose and crossed to a writing desk in the corner of the library, returning with a sheaf of papers. "These are the household accounts for the past 6 months," he said, spreading them on the table between us. "Lavinia has been managing the finances since Eleanor's death. I thought it might be useful to review them, to see if there are any irregularities that might point to her involvement. Together, we pored over the accounts by candlelight, tracing the flow of money through the Ashworth estate. It was tedious work, but illuminating. Lavinia had been meticulous in her record-keeping, every expense accounted for, every payment documented. But as we dug deeper, a pattern began to emerge. Small sums had been withdrawn each month from the household fund, always in cash, always attributed to miscellaneous expenses. Over 6 months, these withdrawals added up to a substantial amount, enough to purchase any number of deadly substances without leaving a trail. "It is not proof," I said, when we had finished our review. She could claim the money was spent legitimately, on repairs or supplies that she paid for in cash. "But it is suggestive," the Duke replied. "It shows opportunity, if not motive." "What is her motive?" I asked. "Beyond the obvious, I mean. She is comfortable here. She has status, security. Why risk everything on a murder that might easily be traced back to her?" The Duke was silent for a moment, his expression troubled. "There is something I have not told you," he said at last. "Something that only Lavinia and I know." Shortly before Eleanor died, she confided in Lavinia that she believed she was with child. It was early days, too early to be certain, but Eleanor was hopeful. She told Lavinia before she told me, wanting to be sure before raising my expectations. And then the fever came, and Eleanor died, and with her any hope of an heir. I stared at him, understanding dawning. "If you were to die without issue," I said slowly, "your cousin Edmund would inherit. But if there had been a child, that child would have taken precedence over any other claim." "Exactly," the Duke said. And Lavinia knew. She knew that Eleanor might have been carrying the next Duke of Ashworth. She knew that her position in this household was hanging by a thread. "You think she had something to do with Eleanor's death," I said. It was not a question. His jaw tightened. "I have wondered." The fever that took Eleanor swept through the county that winter, claiming dozens of lives. But Eleanor was young and healthy. She should have survived. And Lavinia was with her constantly during those final days, nursing her, caring for her. "But you have no proof." "I have nothing but suspicion," he admitted. "And suspicion is not enough to accuse a lady of murder. But if she tried once and succeeded, she would not hesitate to try again. Which is why I must find the evidence to stop her before it is too late." The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, reminding us both of how late the hour had grown. I rose from my chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted I was. "I should return to my chamber," I said. "If I am seen wandering the corridors at this hour, questions will be asked." The Duke nodded, rising as well. "Tomorrow," he said, "continue your observations. Watch Lavinia, watch the servants, watch everything. And be careful, Ivy. If she suspects that you are working against her, your life may be in danger as well." "I am not afraid," I said, and in that moment, I believed it. He walked me to the library door, his hand brushing against mine as he reached for the handle. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt of electricity through my entire body. I looked up at him, startled, and found him looking back at me with an intensity that stole my breath. "Good night, Ivy," he said softly. "Good night, my lord," I replied, and fled into the darkness of the corridor before I could do something foolish. The days that followed settled into a pattern of investigation and subterfuge. By day, I performed my duties as a parlor maid, polishing and cleaning and keeping my eyes open for anything unusual. The work that had once seemed tedious now took on a new significance. Every room I entered was a potential crime scene. Every conversation I overheard might contain a vital clue. I moved through the house like a ghost, invisible and watchful, cataloging details that might have escaped the notice of anyone not trained to observe. By night, I met with the Duke in the library, reporting my observations and helping him piece together the puzzle of who had tried to kill him. These nighttime meetings became the axis around which my life revolved. During the long hours of daylight, I would find myself counting the minutes until darkness fell and I could slip away to that sanctuary of books and firelight. I told myself it was the intrigue that drew me, the intellectual challenge of unraveling a mystery. But I knew, even then, that it was something more. It was him. Cormac Blackwell was not the man I had imagined him to be. The cold, distant aristocrat I had observed from afar was merely a mask, a protective shell he had built around himself after too much loss. In the privacy of the library, away from the watchful eyes of servants and guests, he allowed that mask to slip. I saw the grief he still carried for his wife, the guilt he felt for having survived when she did not. I saw the weight of responsibility that pressed upon him, the burden of a title and an estate that demanded constant vigilance. And I saw, beneath it all, a fierce intelligence and a dry wit that delighted me more than I cared to admit. He told me stories of his childhood, of the brother he had adored and the parents who had loved him. He spoke of his years at Oxford, where he had studied philosophy and dreamed of becoming a scholar. He confessed that he had never wanted to be Duke, that the title felt like a cage he could not escape. And in return, I told him of my own past, the happy years in my father's shop, the slow decline that followed my mother's death, the desperate scramble for survival that had brought me to his doorstep. We were unlikely confidants, a duke and a maid. But in those quiet hours by the fire, the distance between us seemed to shrink until it was barely a whisper. I found myself looking forward to our meetings with an eagerness that frightened me. I found myself thinking of him at odd moments during the day, wondering what he was doing, whether he was safe. I found myself dreaming of him at night, dreams from which I woke with my heart pounding and my cheeks flushed with a heat that had nothing to do with the blankets. It was madness. It was hopeless. It was the most alive I had felt in years. Lavinia, for her part, seemed entirely unruffled by the events of that fateful dinner. She continued to preside over the household with her customary authority, ordering the servants about and making decisions about everything from menu planning to guest lists. If she was aware that she was under suspicion, she gave no sign of it. Her composure was remarkable, almost inhuman in its perfection. I watched her carefully, noting her movements through the house, her interactions with the staff, her conversations with Edmund and the other guests who remained at Ashworth awaiting the conclusion of the investigation. She was charming with Edmund, flattering him with attention and praise, treating him like the heir he might soon become. She was cold with the servants, dismissive and imperious, clearly believing herself above their gossip and judgment. And she was watchful with me. I began to notice her eyes following me as I went about my work. When I entered a room where she was present, her gaze would flicker toward me with a sharpness that belied her languid demeanor. She never spoke to me directly, never acknowledged my existence beyond the bare minimum required by her role as mistress of the household. But I could feel her awareness of me, like a spider watching a fly that had wandered too close to her web. It was Edmund who provided the first real break in the case. The Duke's cousin was a nervous man, ill-suited to the tension that had gripped Ashworth Manor since the poisoning attempt. He spent most of his time in the library, buried in books, emerging only for meals and the occasional walk in the gardens. But one afternoon, as I was dusting the shelves in the library, he approached me with a furtive glance over his shoulder. "You are the maid who saved my cousin's life," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The one who noticed the poison." "I am," I replied cautiously. Edmund's hands twisted together nervously. "I must tell someone," he said. "I cannot keep silent any longer. What I know, it will destroy me either way. But perhaps if I speak, if I confess what I have done, the Duke will show mercy." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart beginning to race. "What have you done?" He looked around again, ensuring we were alone, then leaned closer. "Lavinia approached me a month ago," he whispered. "She said that she could ensure I inherited the title, that she had a way to remove my cousin from the succession without anyone suspecting foul play. She said that if I agreed to support her afterward, To keep her in her position as mistress of Ashworth, she would make me duke. And you agreed? I breathed, hardly able to believe what I was hearing. Edmund's face crumpled with shame. I was weak, he said. I have spent my whole life in Frederick's shadow, then in Cormac's. I have never been anything but the spare, the afterthought, the one who would never amount to anything. When Lavinia offered me everything I had ever dreamed of, I could not refuse. But I did not know she meant to kill him. I thought she had some legal scheme, some way to challenge his claim to the title. I did not know about the poison until that night at dinner. He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. You must believe me, he pleaded. I had no part in the attempt on his life. When I saw that blackened spoon, I was as horrified as anyone. I am not a murderer. I am just a fool who let his ambition blind him to the truth. I extracted myself from his grasp, my mind racing. You must tell the Duke, I said. Everything you have told me, you must tell him. He will have me arrested, Edmund protested. He will turn me over to the magistrate, and I will hang. You will not hang for agreeing to a scheme you did not understand, I said firmly. But if you remain silent, if you allow Lavinia to continue her plotting, you become complicit in whatever she does next. Is that the man you want to be? Edmund stared at me, his eyes wide with fear and indecision. Then slowly, he shook his head. No, he said. No, it is not. I will tell him. Tonight. True to his word, Edmund sought out the Duke that evening and confessed everything. I was not present for their conversation, but I could imagine how it went. The stammering admissions, the desperate pleas for forgiveness, the Duke's cold fury at being betrayed by his own blood. When I arrived at the library for our nightly meeting, I found the Duke standing at the window, staring out at the moonlit gardens with an expression of profound weariness. Edmund has told me everything, he said, without turning around. Lavinia approached him weeks ago, laying the groundwork for my murder. She played on his insecurities, his resentment, his desperate desire to be more than he believed himself to be. She used him, and he was too blind to see it. What will you do? I asked. He turned to face me, and I saw the toll the past days had taken on him. There were shadows beneath his eyes, lines of strain around his mouth. He looked like a man who had been fighting a battle he could not win. I have no choice, he said. I must confront her. Tomorrow I will summon her to my study and present her with what I know. Without a confession, I have only Edmund's word against hers, and a lady's reputation will always outweigh the testimony of a self-confessed schemer. But if I can force her to admit what she has done, if I can break through that mask of composure she wears so expertly, then I will have the evidence I need to bring her to justice. And if she does not confess, then I must find another way, he said. But I will not allow her to remain in this house, plotting my death while smiling at me across the dinner table. One way or another, this ends tomorrow. I should have been relieved. The end was in sight, the villain unmasked, the danger nearly past. But instead, I felt a strange sense of dread, a premonition that the final act of this drama was not yet written. May I speak freely? I asked. The Duke raised an eyebrow. You always do. I fear you are underestimating her, I said. Lavinia is clever, far cleverer than Edmund. She has been planning this for months, perhaps years. She will have prepared for the possibility of discovery. She will have a contingency, a backup plan to protect herself if her scheme is exposed. What would you suggest? Do not confront her alone, I said. Have witnesses present. Have guards ready to restrain her if necessary, and be prepared for the possibility that she may try something desperate. The Duke considered my words for a long moment. You speak as though you know her, he said. I know her type, I replied. I have seen women like her before, women who believe they are entitled to everything they desire and will stop at nothing to get it. They are the most dangerous of adversaries because they have no conscience, no moral compass to restrain them. When backed into a corner, they do not surrender. They attack. He nodded slowly. Very well, he said. I will take precautions, but I must still confront her. I cannot live my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next attempt on my life. This must end. I understood his reasoning, even as I feared for him. He was a man of action, accustomed to facing his problems head-on rather than hiding from them. It was one of the things I admired about him, even though it terrified me in this particular circumstance. Promise me you will be careful, I said, and the intensity of my own voice surprised me. He looked at me, and something shifted in his expression. The weariness was still there, but beneath it, I saw something else, something warm and tender and deeply, frighteningly intimate. I did not expect this, he said softly. Expect what? You, he said. This, whatever this is between us. I thought I would never feel anything again after Eleanor. I thought that part of me had died with her. But when I look at you, Ivy, I feel as though I am waking from a long sleep. I feel alive again for the first time in 2 years. My heart was pounding so loudly I was certain he could hear it. My lord, I began. Cormac, he corrected gently. Cormac, I said, and the word felt strange and wonderful on my tongue. You are a duke, I am a servant. Whatever you think you feel, it cannot be. The world will not allow it. The world can go hang, he said. And before I could protest, he closed the distance between us and took my hands in his. His hands were warm and strong, his grip firm but gentle. I looked up into his face, so close now that I could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, the faint lines at their corners, the curve of his lips as they parted. I know what the world expects, he said. I know what duty demands. I have lived my entire life according to the rules of others, doing what was expected, being who they wanted me to be. But for once, just once, I want to choose for myself. And I choose you, Ivy Mercer, if you will have me. I should have refused. I should have reminded him of the 1,000 reasons why such a union was impossible. I should have pulled away, gathered what remained of my dignity, and fled into the night. But I did none of those things. Instead, I stood there, trembling with the enormity of what was happening, and let myself believe that perhaps, just perhaps, love could conquer all the obstacles that stood between us. I would have you, I whispered. God help me. I would have you. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face from stern and forbidding to something almost boyish. And then he kissed me. It was a gentle kiss, tentative at first, as though he feared I might break or vanish if he pressed too hard. But when I responded, when I leaned into him and parted my lips beneath his, the kiss deepened into something more urgent, more passionate. His hands released mine and moved to cup my face, to tangle in my hair. I clutched at the front of his shirt, pulling him closer, drowning in the sensation of being held, being wanted, being loved. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathless, he rested his forehead against mine and laughed softly. I have been wanting to do that for weeks, he admitted. Only weeks, I teased, my voice unsteady. I have been wanting it since the first moment I saw you. He laughed again, a sound of pure joy that seemed utterly foreign in this house of shadows and secrets. Then we are both fools, he said, but at least we are fools together. We stood there for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, pretending that the outside world did not exist. But of course, it did. And tomorrow, we would have to face it. Be careful, I said again as we finally parted. Please. I will, he promised. And when this is over, when Lavinia has been dealt with and the household is safe, we will talk about the future. Our future. He kissed me once more, a brief brush of lips that nonetheless sent fire racing through my veins. And then he was gone. I returned to my chamber in a daze, scarcely able to believe what had just happened. A duke had declared his love for me. A duke had kissed me. A duke had spoken of a future together as though such a thing were actually possible. It was the stuff of fairy tales, of romantic novels that I had devoured as a girl and dismissed as fantasy. And yet here I was, living it. But even as I hugged my happiness close, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered warnings. Lavinia was still at large. The confrontation had not yet occurred, and until she was dealt with, nothing was certain. Nothing was safe. I did not sleep that night either. But this time, it was not fear that kept me awake. It was hope. The confrontation took place the following morning. I was not present for it, as the Duke had not wanted to put me at risk. But I learned the details afterward, pieced together from the accounts of those who had been there. Cormac had summoned Lavinia to his study under the pretext of discussing household matters. She had arrived expecting a routine meeting, her mask of composure firmly in place. But when she entered the room and saw not only the Duke, but also Edmund, 2 footmen standing guard by the door, and the local magistrate who had been quietly summoned back to the manor, her expression flickered with something that might have been surprise or might have been fear. The Duke had been direct. He had laid out the evidence, Edmund's confession, the irregular withdrawals from the household accounts, her presence in the corridor outside the dining room on the night of the poisoning attempt. He had spoken calmly, coldly, with all the authority of his rank and position. And he had asked her, simply and plainly, to tell the truth. Lavinia's response was exactly what I had feared. She denied everything. She called Edmund a liar and a schemer who was trying to shift blame for his own crimes onto her. She produced alibis for every suspicious moment, explanations for every irregular withdrawal. She wept and pleaded and declared her innocence with all the theatrical skill of an actress on the London stage. For a moment, it seemed as though her performance might succeed. The magistrate was clearly wavering, his gaze shifting between Lavinia's tear-streaked face and the Duke's implacable expression. Edmund was faltering, his earlier courage draining away in the face of her vehement denials. And then Lavinia made a mistake. Perhaps it was desperation. Perhaps it was arrogance, the belief that she had already won and could afford to gloat. But as she wiped the tears from her cheeks and straightened her spine, she looked directly at the Duke and said something that would seal her fate. "You will never prove anything," she said, her voice steady now, all trace of hysteria gone. "Because there is nothing to prove. I am a lady of this house, the widow of your brother, and my word is worth 1,000 times that of a weak-willed cousin and a common maid." The Duke's expression did not change, but his eyes went cold. "A common maid," he repeated. "That girl who fancies herself your savior," Lavinia sneered. "Do you think I have not noticed? Do you think I do not see the way you look at her, the way she follows you around like a lovesick puppy? She is nothing. A boticary's brat with delusions of grandeur. Whatever lies she has been feeding you, whatever schemes she has been weaving to worm her way into your bed and your fortune, I promise you she is not to be trusted." The Duke rose from his chair, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. "You have just made a grave error," he said quietly. "You see, I never told you that Ivy was a boticary's daughter. I never mentioned her background to anyone. The only way you could know that is if you had been investigating her, looking for information to use against her. And the only reason you would do that is if you perceived her as a threat." Lavinia's face went white. "That is not," she began. "Furthermore," the Duke continued, his voice cutting through her protest like a blade, "I never mentioned her role in the investigation to anyone outside this room. I never told anyone that she was helping me piece together the evidence against you. And yet, you knew. You knew she was my savior, as you put it. You knew she had been feeding me information. The only way you could know those things is if you had been watching us, spying on us, which tells me that you are far more involved in this matter than you would like us to believe." The silence that followed was absolute. Lavinia stood frozen, her mind clearly racing as she tried to find a way out of the trap she had walked into. But there was no escape. She had revealed too much, and she knew it. In the end, she did not confess. She simply stopped speaking. Her lips pressed together in a thin line, her eyes burning with hatred. But her silence was as good as an admission. The magistrate, finally convinced of her guilt, ordered her taken into custody pending a formal hearing. As the footman led her from the room, she turned one last look of pure venom upon the Duke. "This is not over," she hissed. "You have not seen the last of me." But it was over. Within a week, further investigation uncovered a cache of letters in Lavinia's chambers, correspondence with an apothecary in London who had supplied her with the arsenic used in the poisoning attempt. The letters detailed not only the plot against the Duke, but also, as Cormac had long suspected, a similar plot that had been carried out 2 years earlier against the late Duchess. Eleanor had not died of natural causes. She had been slowly poisoned over the course of weeks, her symptoms mimicking those of the fever that had swept through the county, masking the true cause of her decline. Armed with this evidence, the magistrate had no choice but to bring formal charges against Lavinia. She was tried, convicted, and sentenced to transportation to the colonies for the attempted murder of the Duke of Ashworth and the murder of Duchess Eleanor Blackwell. It was a lenient sentence, considering her crimes, but the judge had taken into account her sex and her station. Ladies of quality were rarely hanged, even when they deserved it. Edmund, who had cooperated fully with the investigation and whose testimony had been crucial to Lavinia's conviction, was allowed to escape prosecution. The Duke, in an act of mercy that surprised everyone who knew him, declined to press charges against his cousin. Edmund left Ashworth Manor the day after the trial concluded, bound for the continent, where he intended to live out his days in scholarly obscurity. He and the Duke parted on civil terms, if not warm ones, and I never saw him again. And then, at last, it was truly over. The weeks that followed were a time of healing for Ashworth Manor. The shadow that had hung over the household lifted, and light returned to rooms that had been dark for too long. The servants, freed from Lavinia's oppressive presence, went about their duties with a new spring in their step. Laughter could be heard in the kitchens again, and the maids hummed softly as they worked. Even Mrs. Pemberton, that stern guardian of propriety, seemed to soften, her sharp comments giving way to something almost approaching warmth. The Duke, relieved of the constant fear of assassination, began to emerge from his shell of grief and isolation. I would see him walking in the gardens in the early morning, his breath misting in the cold air, his face turned up to catch the pale autumn sunlight. I would hear him playing the piano in the music room, melodies both mournful and hopeful that drifted through the corridors like the voices of ghosts finally finding peace. And I would catch him, sometimes, watching me as I went about my duties, his gray eyes following me with an intensity that made my heart race and my cheeks flush. We continued to meet in the library, though the purpose of our meetings had changed. There was no more investigation to conduct, no more evidence to gather. Now we simply talked, sharing stories and opinions and dreams as the fire burned low and the candles guttered in their holders. He told me of his plans for the estate, the improvements he hoped to make, the tenants whose lives he wished to better. I told him of the books I had read in stolen moments, the ideas that fascinated me, the world I longed to see beyond the borders of this small English county. It was during one of these evenings that he first kissed me. We had been discussing a passage from Plato, of all things, debating the nature of truth and the responsibilities of those who perceive it. I had made some observation that amused him, and he had laughed, a real laugh that transformed his face from stern and forbidding to something almost boyish. And then he had looked at me, really looked at me, and the laughter had faded into something else, something deeper and more dangerous. "Ivy," he had said, his voice barely above a whisper. And then his lips were on mine, and the world fell away. And I, humble Ivy Mercer, found myself at the center of a transformation I could never have imagined. Cormac did not wait long to make his intentions known. 3 weeks after Lavinia's conviction, he summoned me to his study, not for a clandestine meeting, but for an official audience witnessed by Mrs. Pemberton and the family solicitor. I stood before his desk in my black maid's uniform, keenly aware of the eyes upon me, uncertain of what was about to happen. The Duke rose from his chair and came around to stand before me, taking my hands in his, in full view of the witnesses. "Ivy Mercer," he said, his voice clear and strong. "You saved my life. You helped me uncover a murderer. You showed me that there is still goodness and courage in this world, even in the most unexpected places. And somewhere along the way, you captured my heart." I could feel Mrs. Pemberton's shock radiating from across the room, could sense the solicitor's disapproval hovering in the air. But I did not care. All I could see was Cormac's face. All I could feel was the warmth of his hands holding mine. "I know that what I am about to propose is unconventional," he continued. "I know that society will talk, that there will be scandal and gossip and condemnation. But I have learned in recent months that life is too short to be governed by the expectations of others. I have learned that love, true love, is worth any price." He released one of my hands and reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. "Ivy Mercer," he said, sinking to one knee before me, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The room spun around me. I could not breathe, could not think, could not do anything but stare at the man kneeling before me, the man who had somehow seen past my station and my poverty and my insignificance to find something in me worth loving. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes, I will." He slipped the ring onto my finger, a delicate band of gold set with a single sapphire the color of a summer sky. Then he rose, pulled me into his arms, and kissed me with a passion that left no doubt of his feelings. Behind us, Mrs. Pemberton made a small sound that might have been a sob or a gasp of scandalized disbelief. The solicitor coughed pointedly, but neither of us cared. In that moment, there was only the two of us, and the love that had somehow blossomed in the darkest of circumstances. We were married 6 months later in the chapel at Ashworth Manor. It was a small ceremony, attended only by the household staff and a handful of the Duke's closest friends who had proven themselves willing to accept his unconventional choice of bride. The morning of my wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of spring day that seems designed to celebrate new beginnings. I remember standing before the mirror in the Duchess's chambers, rooms that would soon be mine by right, staring at the reflection of a woman I barely recognized. The white silk gown had been made specially for me by the finest dressmaker in London, and it fell in elegant folds from my shoulders to the floor, the train spreading behind me like a river of cream. My hair had been arranged with pearl-tipped pins, and around my neck hung a necklace of diamonds that had belonged to Cormac's mother. I looked like a duchess, but inside I was still Ivy Mercer, the boticary's daughter who had arrived at this house with nothing but a worn leather trunk and a heart full of sorrow. Mrs. Pemberton, of all people, came to help me with my final preparations. She had thawed considerably since Lavinia's departure, and I had come to realize that much of her earlier coldness had been born of uncertainty and fear rather than genuine dislike. As she adjusted my veil and smoothed the folds of my gown, she met my eyes in the mirror. "You have earned this," she said quietly. "I want you to know that. Whatever anyone may say, whatever gossip may spread beyond these walls, you have earned every happiness that comes to you." I was too moved to speak. I simply nodded, blinking back tears that threatened to ruin the careful work her maid had done on my face. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of flowers and music, and the beloved face of the man who waited for me at the altar. I remember walking down the aisle on trembling legs, past the rows of servants who had become my family, toward the future that had seemed impossible only months before. I remember the warmth of Cormac's hand as he took mine, the steadiness of his voice as he spoke his vows, the fierce joy in his eyes when the vicar pronounced us man and wife. And I remember the moment when he lifted my veil and kissed me, claiming me as his duchess before God and the world, and the tears that finally spilled down my cheeks because I had never, in all my wildest dreams, imagined that such happiness could be mine. The society papers had a field day, of course, a duke marrying a parlor maid. It was the scandal of the season, fodder for gossip and speculation and outraged commentary in every drawing room in England. The cartoonists had their sport with us, depicting Cormac as a fool bewitched by a scheming servant girl, and me as everything from a cunning gold digger to a simple-minded country bumpkin who had stumbled into a fortune she did not deserve. But we did not care. We had each other, and that was enough. The years that followed were the happiest of my life. Cormac proved to be a devoted husband, tender and passionate, and utterly committed to our marriage despite the whispers that followed us wherever we went. I proved to be a capable duchess, bringing to the role the same attention to detail and quiet competence that had made me a good servant. The household staff, initially shocked by my elevation, came to accept and even respect me as I earned their trust through fair treatment and genuine kindness. We had no children, a fact that troubled Cormac more than it troubled me. He worried about the succession, about leaving the title to some distant cousin who might prove as unworthy as Edmund. But I reminded him that we had time, that such things could not be forced, that our love was blessing enough even without heirs to carry it forward. He accepted my reassurance with the grace that was so characteristic of him, and we continued to live our lives in quiet contentment. Sometimes, late at night when we lay tangled together in the great canopied bed that had once belonged to generations of Blackwell dukes and duchesses, I would think about the strange path that had brought me here. A boticary's daughter, a pauper, a servant, now a duchess. It seemed impossible, the stuff of dreams and fairy tales. And yet here I was, wrapped in the arms of the man I loved, surrounded by all the luxury and privilege that had once seemed as distant as the moon. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked him once, tracing the line of his jaw with my fingertip. "Do you ever wish you had chosen differently?" He turned his head to kiss my palm, his eyes warm in the candlelight. "Never," he said. "Not for a single moment. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Ivy. You saved my life in more ways than one. Before you, I was a dead man walking, going through the motions of existence without truly living. You brought me back. You gave me a reason to hope again." I smiled, tears pricking at my eyes. "You gave me everything," I said. "A home, a purpose, a love I never dared dream of. How can I ever repay you?" He pulled me closer, his lips brushing against my forehead. "You already have," he murmured. "Every day, every moment, every breath." And so we lived, the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth, defying convention and confounding society with our improbable love. The gossip eventually faded, replaced by new scandals and fresh outrages. Those who had predicted our marriage would end in disaster were forced to admit, grudgingly, that we seemed genuinely happy. And those who had supported us from the beginning took quiet satisfaction in having been proved right. I never forgot where I came from. I never forgot the lessons my father had taught me, the hardships I had endured, the long journey that had brought me from poverty to privilege. I used my position to help those less fortunate, establishing a charity for the widows and orphans of Thornbury, funding a school for the village children, ensuring that no one would ever have to face the desperation I had known in the dark days after my parents' deaths. And I never stopped watching. That was perhaps the most lasting legacy of my time as the Duke's secret investigator. I learned to see what others missed, to notice the shimmer in the steam, the shadow behind the smile. It was a skill that served me well as Duchess, allowing me to navigate the treacherous waters of high society with a confidence that belied my humble origins. But mostly, I simply loved. I loved my husband with a depth and intensity that never faded, even as the years turned his dark hair silver and etched lines of laughter around his beloved eyes. I loved the life we built together, the quiet mornings and the passionate nights, the small joys and the shared sorrows. I loved the woman I had become, a woman who had found her strength in service and her salvation in love. They say that a servant should be invisible, but I learned that true visibility comes not from station or wealth or title, but from the courage to be seen, to speak the truth.